Today we're going to talk about what to do during that first meeting with your mentor. So how to structure that mentoring conversation, what can the agenda look like, how to build a better rapport with that mentor, and I'm going to share some topics that will help you build a stronger relationship with your mentor. I'm also going to share some questions that are really good to help you get to know one another better, and then we're going to talk about what you can do after that meeting as well. When you're having your first meeting with your mentor, it's really important that you create a good first impression. Now, 7% of what you say accounts for the impression that you make. And 38% of your paraverbal, so that's your voice, your tone, how your voice goes up and down, the speed of your voice, that accounts for 38% of the impression that you make. And your nonverbal, which are your facial expressions, how you look, that accounts for 55% of the impression that you make. So a lot of the conversations, you may be lucky to be face-to-face, but a lot of the times these days you're going to be on the phone or on a video conference, and you won't actually have a chance to see that person, right? So you're getting rid of that nonverbal, which accounts for 55% of the impression that you make. But you still need to convey the nonverbal in your paraverbal, right? So that means that you still need to smile when you're talking, because that smile comes across over the phone even. You still have to be passionate. You have to be excited, because they'll hear those things in your voice if they're not able to see you. I remember going to this meeting, and it was for a media organization. And I went into two of their meetings. The first meeting was the editorial meeting. So they talked about what's going into the newspaper or online. And everybody came to the meeting and they just sat there. And in a very dull voice, they talked about what will go into the newspaper or online. And they weren't excited about the news at all. And then I went to a second meeting later on that day, and the same people from the first meeting were in the second meeting, and in this meeting they were brainstorming the features that were going to go online. And they spoke with their hands, they were excited, they were passionate. I didn't even recognize them from the first meeting, they were totally different. So when you're making that first impression on your mentor, you have to speak with excitement and passion, because it's contagious, and that's what helps somebody want to help you. If you go to a meeting and you're complaining about everything and you're just really negative, it's really draining to support you. So especially when you're making that first impression, you have to speak with passion and be excited where you're going and the possibilities. So because you're getting ready for that first meeting, I'm going to show you how you can schedule this first meeting and other meetings in Mentor City. To schedule your first meeting with your mentor, click on the mentor who you'd like to schedule your meeting with. You can bring in your Outlook or your Google Calendar, which makes it easier to schedule those meetings because you don't have to go back and forth in terms of meeting dates. You could also use the send message section to schedule your first meeting. Your first meeting with your mentor should follow the following structure. The first thing that you're going to do is build rapport. Then you're going to get to know one another. You're going to discuss your mentoring objective, the reason for you being there. And then you're going to determine next steps. So we're going to now break down each of these areas in the upcoming slides. So the first one is building rapport. And a great way to build rapport is by having small talk, to discover something that you have in common with your mentor. So there's lots of different things that you could talk about. So you could talk about their weekend plans, or how did their weekend go after the weekend. You could talk about vacations and travel. You may have gone to the same country as they're going to. You might have some tips on where they could visit and what they could see when they're in that country. That's a great way to build rapport. You might have a similar hobby. So you could talk about hobbies. Maybe you both are passionate about posting on Twitter or Instagram. You could talk about how you're successful in Instagram for a couple of minutes. Maybe there's a sports event, or you both work out every day. So it's finding those kind of commonalities. It could be about children, having children, and then asking about how old are your children. It could be the weather, like a lot of people talk about the weather, and yeah, you could start your conversations talking about the weather, especially if it's a very unusual kind of weather day that day. It could be about commuting. I was speaking at one workshop a while ago, and that was the topic. Everyone talked and was very passionate about commuting and how long it takes to get from point A to point B. And also you could talk about the news, current events that are happening in the news. Hopefully not too political, where there's different stances and different opinions, but something that's general in the news might be better for building rapport. So you start off that conversation on the right foot versus the wrong foot. And then you're really listening as you're having this conversation, and you're building upon that shared experience that you have with your mentor and having a little conversation about a commonality, which is going to help you to build a stronger relationship with that person. The next part of the conversation is to get to know that person and get to know one another a little bit better. And here's some questions that you could ask them. These are just example questions. How has your career progressed? To what do you attribute your success to? What was the turning point in your life? Who was your mentor or role model, and what did you gain from this mentor? What is your greatest achievement? Who has been an inspiration in your life? What strategies do you use to stay focused on your goals? Then, once you've gotten to know each other a little bit better, you want to talk about your objectives. So the reason why you're having this mentoring meeting, this mentoring conversation. So discuss the area that you'd like support in. So you've already put this area within the invitation. So it's just talking about it a little bit more in terms of why you're looking to get support in this area. And then you want to ask them a few questions that relate to your mentoring objective or the reason why you're having that conversation. And you should be prepared with, let's say, 3 to 4 questions about that main objective. In terms of next steps, so this is at the end of that mentoring conversation, you want to discuss whether you'd like to meet again with that mentor or with that person, or if the initial conversation was all that was needed. Right? So because you're asking a few questions that are very specific to your objective, you may have got what you needed from that mentor. And those questions are a great way to determine, is there good chemistry, but also can this mentor help out in this area even further? If you're going to meet again, you want to schedule that next meeting at the end of this first meeting so that you both have it on your calendars and you know when you're going to be meeting. And then soon after your mentoring conversation, send a thank you note, because just to say thank you for their time, for their advice, you might want to say something that you enjoyed about the conversation in that thank you note. It's really important to send a thank you note to help that relationship go even further and get the mentor even more excited about supporting you and helping you throughout your journey. After your conversation, you should reflect on how the conversation went. So what did you learn about yourself during the conversation? So jot that down. Jot down what was one thing that you learned about yourself from having that mentoring conversation. What did you learn about the mentor? It could be something personal about the mentor, something in their career, one of their responses, because write down that information. That's really important as well, because you could refer back to that at a later time, at a later meeting. They might have mentioned that they really like a certain sport. So if you read an article about that sport or a certain topic, you could send them that article. And that's about long-term networking with that mentor. What did you enjoy about the conversation? What would you do differently next time? So this is reflecting on your performance. So what did you do good and what would you do differently for your next mentoring conversation? I also want you to write down the lessons learned or the advice that you received during that conversation. Write down everything that you gained from the conversation and then rate it. 1 being not so good advice and 5 being great advice. And sometimes you're going to get great advice and sometimes not so great advice because mentors are only human as well. And then what I want you to do for the good advice is I want you to start to prioritize it. So what can you put into action today? What can you put into action later on? There was this one piece of advice that I received from a career mentor when my career was in a rut. And I was so excited about this advice that I put it into action right away. And at the same time, I asked one of my other mentors what they thought about the advice. And they thought that the advice wasn't good and that it could jeopardize my career. And it ended up to be one of the biggest mistakes that I've made. So if your gut or your intuition is telling you something negative about the advice that you received, listen to your gut and then talk to other people that you trust. Listen to them and then determine if it's something that you want to move forward with or if it's not something you want to move forward with. For the pieces of advice or the lessons learned that were amazing and you want to implement right away, I want you to think of and develop a plan for how you could start implementing that piece of advice. So for month 1 and month 2, you worked on a development area and you worked on a specialized skill and you became stronger in both of those areas. Now you've received a few pieces of advice from this mentor. What's the next thing that you're going to implement into your life, into your career, and how are you going to do that? It's amazing. Like, can you imagine if you implemented one new piece of advice into your life every month? By the end of the year, you will be 12 times stronger.